Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second Urban Design conversation. This event is coordinated by the Master Program Building in Urban Design and Development, and it's part of a series that reflects on the role of urban design in a changed world. Today's theme is Displacement Urbanism. I'm Giovanna Stolfo, for those who do not know me. I'm program leader of the MC BUD and tutor of the module Urban Design in Practice. The session will be chaired by myself and Camille Buono, Professor Camille Buono. Each of these events, part of the series, set up a conversation, or at least they wish to do so, between alumni of the master program and current students. This time, I'm really pleased to introduce our three guests. First, Joanna Dabai. Hi, Joanna, Lebanese architect, researcher, and co-founder of the charity Catalytic Action. Then, Dolendes Mason, architect, urban designer, and lecturer at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. Hi, Belen. Thanks for being with us. It's very early for you. And then Marina Kolovokuri, architect and development practitioner who currently works for the organization Women for the World. Hi, Marina, and thanks for being with us. Why displacement urbanism? In the introduction of a recently published book, Didier Fassin argues that the refugee question is the most vexing of our times, and it's difficult to argue otherwise. If we look at data, for instance, we learned that over 70 million people are displaced worldwide. This means one person in every 100, the majority of them living in the global southeast. The political geography of asylum is quite rich, and hopefully today's conversation that spans from the refugee camps in the Middle East, relocation sites in the Amazon, and the townships in Southeast Asia will make sense of such richness. Displacement is being said to be increasingly protracted. This means that people who are displaced tend to stay displaced for many years. This also means that displacement is generative. It generates other forms of displacement. Displacement is also increasingly overlapping. People usually experience displacement more than once in their lifetime. They also often become hosts of other displaced groups. Finally, displacement is also increasingly urban, meaning that a larger amount of dispossessed and displaced people live or move to cities. The pandemic has magnified the virus, the COVID has magnified and exacerbated all these processes, with the exception of the urbanization of refugees, perhaps. In India, last year, we have seen a mass movement of migrants from cities to rural areas. It seemed that people were turned into refugees overnight. As such, it's a call for us, practitioners, designers, academics, students, to act and react. Oren Iftekel has coined the term displaceability, which we often like to recall, and it refers to urban displacement as a recursive planning measure that is implemented by means of distraction, expulsions, and extractions, as well as other more subtle tools, such as cultural erasure, privatization, apartheid. All these processes are embedded in urbanization worldwide. This, of course, calls into question issues of context, of scale, of subjectivity, and especially agency of the displaced and displaceable. The presence of refugees challenges the urban environment and vice versa. There exists a relational approach between the two, between the city and the refugees. When we speak of displacement, we generally intend the forced movement of people away from a place of origin. In this sense, displacement implies abandoning a place. It's a negative and some sort of subtractive process. But yet, even when displaced, people do engage in placemaking activities. They forge relations. They enhance their connectedness. They get attached to place. They make home. Placement, in other words, is not opposite, but rather constitutive of displacement. This is what we mean by displacement urbanism, the idea that displacement is a spatial process that continuously implies shaping the urban and that reveals agency. It's made of acts that create friction within an existing system of oppression. You see, this is also why it's paramount for us within a master program in urban design to excavate displacement and emplacement. What is the role of design within these spatial practices? Well, today we have invited 3 BAD alumni precisely to discuss this. Looking back and looking through their own experience of activism, of research, and work alongside refugees in different contexts of displacement, they will reflect, hopefully, on the role of design as a vulnerable, as a weak and contested discipline. Now, the conversation today will unfold through a series of presentations, and it will be followed by a discussion, as we did yesterday. Before I hand over to Camillo, who will give us a transdisciplinary overview and contextualization of displacement vis-a-vis urban design, I need to do a bit of housekeeping, as Catalina was saying before. We have a chat space where you can type any question you have for the guest, possibly quick questions, so they can reply straight away. If you have more general questions that apply to all guests, we're happy to take them at the end of the presentations. And you can use the raise hand tool, or you can type the longer question on the chat, and I'll be reading them out loud as you prefer. I think I'm done for now. Camillo, over to you.
Thank you, Giovanna, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to reinforce just briefly through a sort of historical positionality of the way in which not only the discipline, but the discipline that we have shaped, framed, and reflected at the DPU was always somehow tangentially or more directly connecting with this very broad and urban notion of displacement. And I'll do that with 2 vignettes or 2 very simple reflections. The first one is to connect kind of virtually 3 fundamental works that was done historically at the DPU, connecting the work of John Turner in the early 70s, the work of Michael Safier in the 80s and the 90s, and a sort of more recent work that was across the newly shaped of a sort of disastrous version of displacement. And those 3 generations, if you want, of connection, intellectual inquiry into different forms of displacement, to a certain extent, are not only navigating or framing discourses that have the discipline have been confronting with. In the case of John, was definitely not specifically looking at the displacement as the outcome of a process of urbanization, the quebradas and the peripherization of that, but was the fact that was a possible negative outcome of an urban interventions, either through the informalization or through a more direct act of slow temporal improvement. In the second example of Michael Safier was working with the very specific connections of displacement that was the emergence, the act, the outcome, the results of what he would call at that time the domicide. So the impossibility, physical or not, of having a place, having a space, having a house, having a place to live. So the negative version was always confronted into that, but was already embracing the productivity of the urban. So that the displacement was not only the effect of something, but already part of the productions of the subject and the object of the urban. So these 2 generations were somehow then taken over into a more forced migration reflection. And this was due to some of individuals that were coming to work at the DPU, was my work into the post-conflict situation, was the work of Cassidy into the disasters-oriented version, was the work of looking at the way in which urban conditions in transformations of the city were already both the cause and the effect. And I think that was the sort of prominent earlier work that see a completely different version of the what is called the contemporary urban crisis. There was a second other factor that was somehow historically emerging into that. It was the fact that displacement was both overlapping with the migration, so the management and the construction of the sociological, the anthropological, and the political construction of the notion of the migrant, versus another reflection that was on the right base or the right support to both integrations and refugees situation. So there was this moment of the history where those two discourses were coming to a term. And that's where another third element that was very specific into that, it was a shift of geographies or a different engagement with different geographies that were constructing interest, students, demand, research, and partnerships across different numbers of displacement issues. So the point of what I'm trying to say now is that, reinforcing to Giovanna's reflection, is that the displacement is not only a fundamental element of the construction of the transformation of the cities because of the contingency, but is the place through which the crisis of the urban has to be looked through in order to put it in a sort of longer spectrum of reflection. So it's not only inevitable to look through, but is very much historically constructed and intellectually grounded in the fact that making place is a continuous challenge, is a continuous effort, is a continuous activity of the placemaking, the language that Giovanna was using. So the fact that there was always a way of constructing a collective, possibly collective life. Of course, now is quite central to a sort of geopolitical discourse or epistemic discourse, both in Europe and not. But this opened a third and last, the challenge that we do have at the moment as institutional research is to shift the methodological inquiry from something that was very spatially oriented to something that is subjectively constructed. So to look at the way in which the displacement construct a new urban subjectivity. And this is in the new vague of looking at research in specific locale, in looking at the very territorial constructions of those movements, either in Peru, in the Amazonas, or in the urban pressure displacement, is understanding less the sociological dynamic, but the construction of new urban subjectivities that are emerging out of that. And this remained a very fundamental challenge and a very probably question that was. But this was not just out of the blue, but was grounded into all these different traditions of research that was still very emerging into the development planning unit. Of course, the scenario and even the institutional scenarios that UCL have come across recently as very differently. A few years ago, we have been part of a very fundamental movement of constructing what is now called the Institute of Humanitarian Studies, which is a fundamental cross-disciplinary reflection that institute that reflect from that very perspective into that. Or big project in the new generation of research project, being No or being Relief, where too the notion of displacement become very in not only the condition, but an aspect of a construction of a new urban identities, if you want. There was a numbers of others reflection, including what is now for many of you is quite different, is the UCL Grand Challenge. Early, the UCL Grand Challenges was not looking at displacement as something that was constitutional or constituent to the notion of sustainability. It was something that was park aside. And all these discourses, research, and people were very much constructing this very idea. Now, the challenge is methodology, the challenge is engagement, the challenge is personal construction of subjectivity. There is still very much the new version, the new contemporary, if you want, reflections into that. So just my aim of this 5 minutes was more to construct the fact that is not only the present condition, but is also that the present condition emerged both historically, institutionally, in terms of a discourse in relation to that. And that urban design is not fundamentally centered, but is absolutely a central area of reflection, because this is super central at different scale. And this is what probably makes our relevance into the reflection today. And I'm stopping now.
Thanks, Camilo. Thanks a lot. I'm happy to give the floor to Joanna now. So just let me introduce her very briefly. Joanna's recent work revolves around working closely with displaced and host communities in Lebanon to co-design inclusive educational and recreational places. This includes participatory research, co-design, and community engaged implementation of built interventions with a focus on play and the public realm. Joanna, I'm happy to hand over to you. If you want to share your screen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. That works. Okay. So hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to present the work of our charity to the bodies. I hope next time we get to meet in person. So today I'll speak to you about some of our projects, but first I would like to briefly introduce to you the work of our organization and our overall objectives. Catalytic Action started in 2015 from an idea of Bud alumni who recently graduated. It was around year 2014. And we wanted to apply our knowledge and experience in architecture and urban design to serve vulnerable communities and children in particular. We started with this simple idea of providing a safe space to play for Syrian refugee children living in Lebanon. And to fund the project, we simply put together a crowdfunding campaign, and thanks to the support of many people who believe that play is a fundamental right, we implemented our first playground project. The playground was designed and built through a participatory approach that engaged the children and the local community. Catalytic Action is a charity that works to empower vulnerable children and their communities through participatory built interventions. We champion the co-production of dignified built environments where everyone can take part in the creation of equitable, inclusive, and sustainable communities. And we do that through practical projects in humanitarian architecture and multidisciplinary research. So since our first playground project, we adopted a participatory approach to research, design, and implementation in all our initiatives. What does participatory design and how did we use it? So during the participatory design phase, children share their visions and aspirations of the project. We work with children from displaced community, but also from the host community, and use this participatory design also as a way to understand the visions and understand the similarities or not. During these activities, children imagine spaces that make them feel happy, where they like to spend their time with their families and friends, but also they get the chance to really engage in design activities depending on the age groups. For example, here our local architect Fatima is working with young children in the Quarantina Park to understand their feedback about the existing space and together shape it and change it in Beirut. This activity is empowering for both the children and the designers. Designers learn from the children and the children learn from the designers, understanding how things are built, but most importantly, understanding again their ideas and their input towards the space that we want to create. So throughout the years, we developed a wide range of participatory design methodologies, which enabled us to have the right tools to be able to fully engage with different groups that are going to use the space that we design. And for this reason, developing context-appropriate tools and processes is the first step towards a successful inclusive design. So speaking about context appropriate, I want to introduce you a bit to some of the contexts where we worked with in Lebanon, most of which are contexts of various forms of displacement and history of displacement, I would say. Here, for example, like vulnerable families live in urban and rural areas. They can live in such informal tented settlements like this Syrian refugee settlement in Barilies, or another Syrian refugee settlement in El Marj, or in dense urban neighborhoods where resources are very scarce and public infrastructure's capacities are overstretched, such as the Palestinian camp of Burj al-Barajni in Beirut, or in urban areas in cities such as this one in Mina, which is a social housing. So when investments are made to change these conditions, built environment professionals often tend to take an easy route of purchasing, for example, off-the-shelf items, which is considered to be a good solution to respond to the lack of specific needs in the built environment. For example, an off-the-shelf play item for a playground project. Yet, adopting this approach often results in a hard maintenance and upkeep of these spaces that do not respond to the local needs of the children or their communities. So at Catalytic Action, in order to truly promote people's rights to dignified built environments, intervention should not only be focused to the final product and on implementing preconceived notions of what a space should be, but should rather focus on the processes that lead to the implementation of space that values the visions, aspirations, skills of the local community. This is why we have developed this set of values that we use in our projects. And only in this way that we can co-create places that promote residents' rights and sense of belonging to their neighborhoods, taking and having in mind the diversity of the people living in the neighborhood. This participatory approach and set of values were used in 4 inclusive parks that we implemented in 2019 in partnership with Terre des Hommes Italy and UNICEF Lebanon. I'll show you through the project how we use them to make it a bit more clear. So what do we mean by inclusive design, and what was key for us to design in these 4 spaces that we created? For us, it was important to focus on inclusive design as a way to generate opportunities for everyone to play and interact with each other in a positive way. An important element of the project was also to extend the notion of inclusivity to include children with disability, despite their nationality or religious background or other lenses of identity, but enable them to equally engage with children their age. And this meant to develop technical and spatial solutions that allowed for these interactions to take place. So all these projects have been designed following the similar logic, which aims at creating spaces for children to run, to release energy, engage through active play, to build new friendships, to learn about sounds, optics, and other educational topics, to explore and develop new skills, to imagine, and also to see their visions, such as this case, a bird, come to reality. Okay, so when we work with these different children to create these spaces, barriers such as displaced communities and host communities come to break, and we create this process and these spaces as a way to create like this inclusive design, where we're creating like a platform for these different communities to meet and engage in these positive encounters. But also when we're designing, even though we focus a lot on working with children, we also work with the caregivers, because for an inclusive design, especially in the public realm, we acknowledge the importance of caregivers in the lives of their children, but also we want to create spaces that foster social cohesion also for all the community. And for that reason, we also engage with the caregivers in the process where they actually share their visions of the space and get to use the spaces later with their families, with their children or grandchildren. During lockdown, since what mentioned recently in the presentation and the introduction of Giovanna with COVID, we saw that public spaces were actually, and the spaces we've created were very valuable, and we received pictures from people using these spaces, which show that even in these vulnerable contexts where people usually live in overcrowded homes, public spaces is even more important, and we saw this renewed value. So when we speak of the inclusive design and what do we mean by a process also being inclusive, it's also through the choice of materials and the choice of the design themselves. So we try to reach the wider community by creating equipments that are locally fabricated and which generates livelihood for the people living in the community, such as like these spinning cubes that are locally manufactured, or this roller table, roller slide, which is a slide for children with physical disability that was also locally manufactured. And lastly, I would like to conclude with a project that is ongoing now in Beirut. It is how we can use or work starting from public spaces after a disaster that hit Beirut on the 4th of August in like almost exactly 6 months ago. So after the 4th of August Beirut blast, we revisited the community that we worked with in the neighborhood of Karantina back in 2016, a community and a location that was severely hit by the explosion. And the reason we revisited it, not just because it was severely hit, but only to really like check up on the people that we met in 2016 and to try to understand how we can go back to them and try to help with this really drastic event that happened. So we decided to work on rehabilitating the public park. In the public park in 2016, as you can see in this picture, this is a young Lebanese boy we worked with to envision the playground space that we created there. And then again, we came back in 2020 to work with them again. And this alone shows that you're doing this because you care and not just because of the event. So what did we do? Like, to explain a bit further, we developed a project that we called Kanya Makan, which is still ongoing. And because we realized that the Karantina Public Garden is very important at this current time, in a context that didn't only witness a destruction, but in a neighborhood that is extremely vulnerable, since it witnessed a history of displacement, of Armenians, of Palestinian, and recently of Syrian refugees, and COVID, and then the explosion, and we realized that the kids really needed this space to heal, a space to belong, especially in these challenging circumstances. So we joined the forces and partnered with Terrorism Italy, UNICEF, AUB Neighborhood Initiative, Nusanid NGO, and Impact Lebanon to rehabilitate the space through a co-design process with the creation of a multi-purpose room inside the park, to design and implement a program with children, to go design a safe space in the garden, to activate the garden through programmatic activities, and to lobby to ensure that the garden is open to the public. So working with the Beirut municipality to ensure that this space is not just renovated today, but it will continue on being used as a space for social encounters and a space for the community itself. And we also engage the children, even in the rehabilitation. We try to engage them through tangible activities, such as this one, where the tile becomes an important element in a bench, for example. And this is just a small example of how a small act can really empower the children. So we do acknowledge that people's involvement in shaping the built environment is very crucial, especially in a time where a lot of conflict, lots of displacement, and lots of hardship is endured by the communities. And what we're trying to do is to simply use our skills and knowledge to bring back hope and more sustainable communities. Yeah. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. Thank you. Wonderful projects and wonderful approach. Your principles of inclusive design and working with children will definitely raise a lot of interest. I know a few of our buddies are working with children too. I saw Dina's question on the chat. but I'm pretty sure there will be more questions from Chiara and Lorenzo. I'm happy now to introduce the next speaker, Belen Mason. Belen research focuses on climate refugees, settlement relocation, socially and environmentally just urban practices, social housing, planning and urban design in the Global South. She's the coordinator of CASA. CASA is for Ciudades Autosostenibles Amazónicas. Sorry, my Spanish accent is not the best, which means self-sustainable cities in the Amazon, an action research project which explores settlement relocation in the Amazon rainforest. She's also the city lead for the Lima chapter of the KNOW, which is KNOW stands for Knowledge in Action Towards Urban Equality, where she co-produced special interventions to challenge the raising food insecurity in vulnerable neighborhoods in Lima and seek to unveil structural drivers of inequality in the metropolis. Belen, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I did my presentation a little bit different, so I have a more reflections than presenting the projects themselves, but let's see how it goes. Give me 1 second.
Can you share your screen?
Yeah, I'm working on that.
Let me know if you need any help.
Yeah, it's there. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Belen.
Yes.
You can see it. Good.
Okay, great. Well, first, thank you to Camilo, Giovanna, and Catalina for the invitation to speak on this increasingly important topic, which is becoming more and more urgent due to a variety of reasons. And this displacement or being taken away from your place voluntarily, but more often forcibly, has enormous consequences, oftentimes measuring physical, economic, and quantifiable terms, and in ways that seek to render visible those that are responsible for the wrongdoing and made to pay for the consequences. But I'm here to talk about the other dimensions that are usually rendered invisible in climate change and displacement policies, specifically those that pertain us as urban designers. That is, I'm here to talk about place, the impacts of losing it, the challenges faced of not taking into account in policy making and proposing different approaches towards displacement that seek to incorporate place as a concept and as a way of operating. And what do we mean with place? I want to refer to two readings during this brief presentation, to which you can refer later on. So This Must Be the Place, under representation of identity and meaning in climate change decision making, and Palaces for the People. In the first one, Adger discusses the cultural impacts of climate change, which are non-material and are difficult to measure. This paper has a particular focus on places which are defined by social processes and relations and which acquire individual and communal significance, showcasing how localized material and symbolic values are undervalued in the political and economic lenses of climate change policy and science. The authors developed the concept of environmental integration, how people and their history are intertwined with the local environment. They also seek to render visible how traditions are under threat due to the irreversible loss of nature. They argue how a focus on place highlights the local material and symbolic context in which people create their lives and through which those lives derive meaning. And that there is a necessity towards a shift from an economic perspective in climate change policy towards an approach based on principles of human rights and justice. This is because the loss of place cannot be compensated. Within the human rights and justice approach, the authors call for a recognition of traditional ecological knowledge, which is composed of practices and beliefs of how the natural world works, integral to culture. Ecological knowledge includes a repertoire of habits, skills, and styles from which people construct their livelihoods, which are manifest through rules about governing resource management systems and through worldviews about the place of humans within the natural world. Here, adaptation research can seek to understand the adaptation strategies that have been adopted in the past and which may be relevant for the future, and also generate knowledge exchange, integrating new knowledge that can be incorporated into ecological knowledge to adapt to new circumstances. So the paper discussed mainly indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge in Alaska and in the Pacific Ocean, and presents a territorial and vast approach of the dimension of place. But I work in a more of a peri-urban and urban setting in Iquitos and in Lima, with communities that are descendants of indigenous populations, but that also brings the discussion of what a modern, using that concept carefully here, concerns and world visions would be. What happens when you work in the urban more like in indigenous settings. So that brings me to a more of the second reading. So Klinenberg discusses how during a heat wave in Chicago, two neighborhoods with exactly the same socioeconomic status and ethical backgrounds reported two very different numbers of death by heat strokes. So he asked what was the difference. So one neighborhood lacked public spaces and infrastructures. They didn't have any libraries, churches, or community centers. Neighbors didn't know each other, so there were no bonds of community, care, and solidarity. No one noticed if people went missing. And Klinenberg calls those spaces that foster that sense of community and the networks that are formed there, the social infrastructures. And that's what I think we should also be thinking about in more urban settings. So that different scale of place from the territory to public infrastructure and services in an urban setting, but that also consolidates spaces of community and care. So in both cases, we see the important symbolic and social links that are created between space and communities. The latter cannot thrive, prosper, or flourish without places. That is, those places in all scales that foster feelings of belonging, of community, and of home. Thus, in Displacement Urbanism, the loss of place and its subsequent psychological, social, environmental, and economic impacts is of utmost importance. It is there that our role as designers, as architects, or as practitioners interested in spatial practices becomes important, as we can engage with those everyday practices, become mediators, and provide platforms, media, devices for their voices or their places to be heard, to be seen, to be recognized, and to be treated fairly. So now I would like to briefly present to you two projects that I work with since I graduated from BUD and that deal with this issue of place, or the lack thereof, and displacement. The first one is CASA, Self-Sustained Amazonian Cities, which I work with Camilo and Giovanna, and which deals with climate refugees in the Amazon rainforest currently being displaced by the Peruvian government in a housing project that fails to recognize their unique ways of living. And this exploration actually started during my times at BUD, and it was part of my dissertation. And the second one is the Lima chapter of No, which is led by Karen Levy, and in which a number of DPU staff are participating as researchers, including Catalina. And there we study the linkages between everyday practices of urban inequality and the symbolic qualities of space, places, and infrastructure. And recently, due to the pandemic, those inequalities and injustices were rendered visible the unsustainability of the precarious living conditions of those living in the peripheries in conditions that severely limit the possibilities of producing place. The placelessness of those conditions led, on one hand, to massive feelings of displacement as recent migrants returned from Lima and other cities to the villages, either by car or by walking, or to the emergence of community kitchens in areas where the communal places for those activities to occur remain non-existent. That is the emergence of social infrastructure in the times of crisis. So in the Amazon rainforest, you have a situation where the state is obliterating place through violent practices of technocratic approaches that fail to integrate an approach based on rights and the recognition of other worldviews. And in Lima, the impossibility to consolidate a sense of place in the peripheries is quickly connected to the injustices faced by citizens unable to prosper. In Casa, we work with the residents of Belén, a historic flooding neighborhood in the center of Iquitos, which is the largest Amazonian city of Peru, which is only reachable by boat or by airplane. And approximately 16,000 people live there, a neighborhood that has been part of Iquitos since its very inception. The city largely depends on Belenians for its functioning, as the largest market of the city is located in the neighborhood, and most of its residents work directly or indirectly there. Belenians call themselves amphibian residents and are completely used to adapting the streets and houses to the changing seasons of the river. Children learn to swim and walk at the same time, and they use boats to move from one place to another. However, I do not want to fall into the trap of romanticizing the living conditions of millennials. They live in overcrowded houses, lacking basic services, most notably sanitation, which results in high levels of contamination and pollution, leading to high rates of diseases. Additionally, there are high rates of teenage pregnancy and domestic violence. Therefore, the concept of place or home cannot be taken for granted as a positive characteristic for everyone. It needs to be deconstructed to discuss ways in which it can be improved for everyone. And due to the changing course of the Amazonian River, the neighborhood will be eventually swiped away. And for that reason, the national government decided to relocate them under a law of preventive relocation. That law is quite unique in the Americas, as only Peru and Colombia have it, and it will become more and more necessary as the number of climate refugees is expected to rise in the coming years. The urgency to improve relocation processes as well as the provision of settlements of these refugees increases. However, current practices are top-down and in Latin America in particular, emulate previous experiences of social housing provision in the region, which are located in cheap land in the outskirts of cities, detached from them, lacking transport systems, proper infrastructure and services, and offer a monotonous and repetitive design of houses that do not meet the minimum standards of living. These type of practices result in the disruption of people's lives, in increased violence, the loss of livelihoods, and in the case, severely impacts the surrounding ecosystem as people go into the forest for hunting and deforestation for survival. At CASA, we work with a multiplicity of actors, the national and local governments, residents in Belém, local universities and activists, and seek ways in which alternative visions of Amazonian settlements can be achieved, not only in physical terms, but as a process in which people have a greater voice in decision-making and in the realization of their futures. We understand that city making is more than housing provision, and that we necessarily have to step beyond the discussion of housing quality, and first and foremost discuss livelihoods in older diversity and in ways that promote social justice and environmental sustainability. For this, a prerequisite is that the spaces co-produced respond to the social, cultural, and environmental particularities of the context that we work with, and so that they can be appropriated by people becoming places. In that sense, we seek to promote alternative models for Amazonian urbanism and city making, while reasserting the rights of displaced populations towards having a place to live with standards defined by them. Let me check, why is it not working? And in a very different context, in the peripheries of Lima, which are characterized by their arid conditions, with very little rainfall, but with very high levels of humidity during the winter seasons, and with a fragile ecosystem known as lomas. Here we have that the population of Lima grew tenfold since the latter half of the 20th century, and the self-made urbanization practices became famous through the work of John Turner, which Camilo mentioned earlier on, and others. And in this scenario, people themselves, when given the right support, can produce their own housing and can do so better than the government. However, his message has been co-opted and used in politics for a more clientelistic approach to urbanism, in which city making is reduced to the endless provision of property titles in high-risk areas which are less and less reachable. The provision of places, whether that is housing or public spaces or infrastructure, is almost absent. Roads, paths, or other means of accessibility are also more constrictive given the difficulties of the terrain. The possibilities of making place, either by families, communities, or through collaborative work between citizens, local government, and other actors, becomes more and more difficult. This is a very gross oversimplification of a very complex topic in a very short time, but I'm trying to be as concise as possible. However, I do want to call attention to an ongoing current debate which puts into question the sustainability of this mode of urbanization, given its increasing multidimensional fragmentation. Fragmentation of the territorial as the landscape becomes more and more steep and difficult to occupy. Fragmentation of the social as the social groups become smaller, have less communication between them, and compete between themselves for resources, including land management, rather than the working in collaboration. And fragmentation of the political, as there is a preference for short-term programs and policies rather than the co-creation of a joint vision of ways in which the city could become inhabitable by all, or a place for all. These precarious living conditions were made even more visible during the pandemic. As I was telling you before, recent migrants fled the city in any way they could back to their villages, to their places of origin, where they had these social networks that could support them and where they could at least try to produce their own food, which was made impossible during the lockdown. Second, community kitchens started to emerge in places where there was no social or public infrastructure. So they happened in open spaces, rotating in different houses. This follows a long tradition of groups of women organizing in solidarity networks to care for their communities. The questions that we ask ourselves as development practitioners is how to move beyond this crisis, how to sustain those practices of care and solidarity to challenge the multidimensional fragmentations I described earlier. A first step is to recognize the necessity to diversify the activities so that they are not only the provision of meals, to recognize the labor of these women so that it stops being seen as voluntary work, which is dependent on funds from elsewhere. In that sense, our role as designers can be to co-create those places for the necessary transitions to occur, for the very local scale of an architectural project to a more systemic approach of an urban transformation, but also, and perhaps more importantly, through the design of alternative ways of governing and managing these resources in ways that are more inclusive and allow a greater participation of those working on the ground on decision-making processes. Well, I think I'm running out of time, so I just wanted to conclude with some reflections. I came here to present ongoing activities and projects with more than answers, and to present ways in which designers and career designers, a career which has historically been elitist and not sufficiently critical and proactive, can engage with present needs in these defining times. The upcoming years will be characterized not only by the consequences of the pandemic, but also by a greater challenges ahead due to the impacts of climate change and the unequal distribution of its impacts and in the growing inequalities in human settlements. So I think it's important to understand what our role as practitioners is and how we can create places to showcase place as a fundamental component of urbanism and policymaking. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Belen. Fantastic. I think we all have more questions than answers. Definitely more questions than solutions anyway. Thanks also for unpacking for us the notion of place related to belonging. It's quite interesting to see, as we were discussing last week, I think, how the two cases that you presented imply an opposite movement from the jungle of the rural areas to the city and from the city to the periphery somehow, and how these movements have become so much more visible, dramatically visible because of COVID. Thanks for your reflections.